Thank you, Rafa. Thank you, Nole. Very familiar words if you've ever seen that little ESPN snippet of the 2012 Australian Open final, and 12 years later, it still rings as prevalent as ever. I actually really wanted to do this video after their Olympics match, and I did have about 20 minutes of this thing recorded, but I can't seem to find it, so we're going to do it all over again, and I finally have an occasion that's befitting of it again. These two meeting on a tennis court, and I did not expect the Six King Slam to give me possibly my biggest dosage of the feels. Really striking that nostalgia vein yesterday with Rafa and Novak playing one last time as professionals. Something we know now with all complete certainty, as I haven't made a video since Rafa announced his retirement a little over a week ago. All of us as fans, we were just happy to get a chance to see him play tennis, singles potentially for the last time, even though, not in an official match. Still pitting him up against, the best in the world, and obviously his great rival of nearly 2 decades. The tennis itself not really important, as far as the context of this video. I really just want to talk about this rivalry, and it really does mean a lot to me because obviously I became the ardent tennis fan in, pretty much late 2010 during that US Open. In fact, it was that tournament where I latched on to the guy in the sick all-black fit with the cool long hair who struck just the most unique and indescribably satisfying forehand that I've ever seen, that, to this day, still elicits a dopamine hit like none other. It just scratches an itch in my brain every time, and I mean quite literally to this day. I mean, feeling it again yesterday in that second set with a couple of those screaming forehands up the line and running forehands. Nothing will ever compare to the Rafael Nadal forehand for me ever again in sports. And if, you're familiar with the time, if you followed tennis, obviously you'll know that tournament ended with, one of Rafael Nadal's best hardcourt outings of all time, and completed, his career Grand Slam against none other than Novak Djokovic himself in the pair's first ever Grand Slam final. And little did we know, a storm was brewing, in that 23-year-old at the time Novak Djokovic, and that matchup that we saw in the 2010 US Open final was only a precursor of what was to come, as the premier rivalry in men's tennis shifted away from Rafa and Roger to Rafa and Novak. And so it goes without saying that, I was not there for Wimbledon 08. I was not there for the Aussie in 09. I didn't get to see, Miami 05, Rome 06, etc., etc. I was, however, front row to the best part of what was to come in, the most frequent head-to-head in all of men's tennis. At that point, had a little over 20 matches racked up already. Who would have known that we would get to 60 14 years later? Sort of just surreal numbers, and it really was the next act of this rivalry. For why Novak Djokovic, obviously he is the guy that's inflicted the most amount of pain on my favorite player. At times you could even call me a hater, because that's just kind of how the cookie crumbles. As a fan, a lot of the times that's just how rivalries work, and I do feel like tennis discourse just needs to, know that that's okay. Because a lot of the times I feel like we try to find these personal reasons of why not to like a guy. Over the years, more recently I've seen these bigger character issues sort of be extrapolated from big picture, very trivial stuff. Like, to me, it's never been that deep that anybody's done anything to warrant character attacks. And especially in regards to, the guys, the main figures in this golden era of tennis. Pretty much all of those guys are class acts. All of those guys are phenomenal role models. That's just the bottom line. And sometimes it literally is as simple as He's standing in the way of my favorite player or team winning, and I do not like that. Obviously, there's moments here and there you can nitpick, heat of the moment, especially with the stakes that these guys have been playing with, particularly over the last decade plus. But certainly nothing has ever really been a huge stain on character or something of that nature. But anyways, after getting a little bit sidetracked there, I will always have a soft spot for Novak Djokovic because, over that 2011-2014 stretch for one, obviously, those matches are core memories for me as a tennis fan, Rafa fan. I said, I wasn't there for peak Vidal, well, I was front row for, peak Djokodal. Every single match from that point. But secondly, more importantly, in that stretch, it was the matches with Novak Djokovic that really, as a fan, made me come to the realization that, like, oh shit, I stand an absolute stud of a player. Like, it was after that period on the other end of it where I was like, damn, I really, stan one of the greatest of all time. And I know, already when Nadal captured that career Grand Slam in 2010, by the numbers, he was already one of the greatest of all time. But let me expand upon that, right? So taking you back to 2010, at the end of the year, we are at a point in time where, Rafael Nadal, top of the world, the matchup always favored him against Roger Federer, and Roger Federer's only getting older. He's turning 30 the next year. Rafa, smack in the middle of his prime. And he also has, still a sizable edge over the rival that's closer to him in age, in Novak Djokovic. It really seems like, the passing of the torch from the dominant figure being Federer, it's now being handed off to Rafael Nadal, and, he seems peerless at the moment. And, I came to this conclusion a couple years ago, looking back on it. I don't know if it was a thing of social media or us just being caught up in the duopoly at that point, but the signs of Novak Djokovic someday becoming a monster, they were all over. The 2011 explosion obviously, blindsided us, but should it really have been that out of the blue? Tennis-wise, I think it was just him stagnating in 09 and 10. But between, his age 19 and 21, the dude was legitimately a prodigy. 07 and 08, those were some of the finest seasons you'll see for somebody aged that young. And in the context of just this rivalry, throughout the course of even pre-2011 Djokovic, the warning signs were all there that, Novak Djokovic was the bad matchup for Rafael Nadal. And you might look at a head-to-head that I think at that point was 16-7 at the end of 2010 and say, how would that be the case? Well, you look into that, even through that spin, Novak Djokovic held a winning record over Rafael Nadal, even heading into the 2010 US Open on hard courts. And on clay, it's been pretty obvious throughout the course of Rafa Nadal's pretty much unblemished big picture clay career that Djokovic was his biggest challenge even there. And again, the precursors to that being the case were certainly there. I know Djokovic didn't score his first win on clay over Nadal until 2011, but take a look at 08 Hamburg, even 08 RG. Nadal arguably his most dominant romp through a Roland Garros ever. Djokovic still played him the most competitively by far. I think he got to a tiebreak in the third, and Hamburg 08 is one of the most underrated matches of their entire rivalry. It's really just the lack of a dramatic third set, but other than that, the quality is honestly one of their best matches ever. Again, with a Rafa Nadal that was arguably in his best ever clay form, if not one of them. 09, you have their clay trilogy, which is more well-renowned. Brutal match in Monte Carlo, and then even more brutal match in Madrid. That's the one we all know. A match that you could say was such a titanic battle in the semifinals of a Masters that arguably left them battered for the better part of the rest of that season, both of them. All this to say, Djokovic was right there. I mean, even the years where you kind of say he maybe took a step back in 09 and 10 after that, is still firmly a top 3-4 player in the game. And after, career worst season up till August of 2010, from the North American season to the end of the year, he did flip the script and build some momentum going into, obviously, your coming out party in 2011. And Davis Cup aside, winning Davis Cup for Serbia at the end of the year, I can't really tell you why nobody took notice. This was kind of percolating. And, with the gold standard at that point, that was Rafa. There are all these breadcrumbs of, him potentially being a thorn in the side. But we get to 2011, world's supposed to be Nadal's oyster, and we get through January, February, March, all the way to May. And one man hasn't lost a match, and it's Novak Djokovic. Obviously, the bastion of objectivity at the time, 10-year-old me and Rafael Nadal basically being my superhero every subsequent time. We're like, okay, it's time to show young fella his place. You had a good run, but let the world number one take it from here. And, every successive match, it's just blind faith. Indian Wells, horrible serving performance. Aberration, we'll get him next time. Miami, phenomenal match. First time I actually ever saw Nadal tire, but it must have been the heat. That had to be a one-off, and we barely missed out there. Onto our turf, onto the clay. Beats him in straights in Madrid. It's like, Madrid's not exactly your typical clay court. Run it back again. And then Rome. Even for me, that first inkling of doubt creeps in, and a small voice in the back of your head is like, is this guy beatable? And Rome 2011, I mean, that's one of the best tournaments Novak Djokovic has ever played. It's ball striking from another world. If you get a chance to run back those highlights, I highly encourage doing so. And you're actually beginning to pick up on some things that you've never seen as it pertains to the Nadal side of the net. Here's a guy that, throughout the course of his career, from the word go, people questioned the sustenance, going so hard every single point. It had to take its toll. It had to lead to, a quick burnout. But as far as the tennis itself, Rafael Nadal just needed to iron out the kinks in his game. Obviously he showed up to the scene pretty raw as a complete offensive package, forehand aside. But he's just this ball of energy and physicality and athleticism that he kind of takes to a new level in this sport. That coupled with his leftiness and the uniqueness of his forehand and how heavy it is, and with the one-of-a-kind spins he generates, he creates a whole different set of dimensions on a tennis court you have to account for. And tactically, an understanding of space that really optimizes the uniqueness of that forehand. It allows him to really just play to his patterns, oftentimes put a righty backhand in backhand jail, just repeatedly forcing a righty backhand to hit these shoulder chest height balls where you can't really do all that much with them, and if you try to take it on the rise, it's just an extremely high degree of difficulty shot, making for this really, really high margin tennis he can play, all while being the best defender in the sport at that point. And yet it still feels like he can put his forehand on a dime at will wherever he wants, all while being the best defender in the sport. When opponents do get on top of points, he's tracking down all these unthinkable gets. And all these years, Rafa's just getting better and better at that, imposing himself more, being more offensive-minded, improving all these different facets of his game, the net play, the serve. He's really become an all-rounder, and that, coupled with the results over the last year, it should spell domination because, fundamentally, all these guys are having to adjust to Nadal. Not with Djokovic, though. With every passing match in 2011, it became obvious that this time it was Nadal, for the first time, that was going to have to adjust to somebody else. The Djokovic backhand, especially at this time, probably the best, there's ever been, completely throws a wrench in Nadal's approach. Novak's a guy who on both wings is more comfortable than most hitting out on balls above chest height effectively. And here not only do you have a backhand that can sustain the barrage of Nadal's lefty high RPM forehand, it's one that gives it back with interest and can elicit and punish the short balls that the Nadal forehand occasionally was prone to coughing up like no other. And obviously, Nadal was not this unsolvable puzzle at the time. He still lost, obviously, as anyone does. There were days where, he would have an off day. There were days when the opponent was just too good on the day. See the first couple matches with Federer on grass. But through it all, it was still Nadal just playing his game and living with the results. And the results, obviously, to that point, very, very good. Not to mention, he was, considered, and I would probably think he himself in the back of his mind, when he got into these super tight, high leverage moments, he would be able to back himself mentally and physically. As a competitor, I would think every time Nadal got into one of these wars, especially in his prime, you're backing yourself, both mentally and physically at the time. The guy had all the reason in the world to believe that I'm just going to resist and be able to dig deeper than my opponent. But here comes Novak Djokovic, not only a player that is stylistically tailor-made to beat him, but both mentally, physically, endurance-wise, all of it, he's on that level as well. And now you have someone whose will matches Nadal's when the chips are down. It's much more of a coin flip. And obviously, when we did get the epics between these two, that's why it was so awesome to watch, because it was like, a gladiator cage fight type deal. And Djokovic, 2011 on, makes Nadal start to realize that I'm going to have to embrace being a little bit more uncomfortable. A couple of those lower percentage corridors that you see Nadal stray away from unless he's super, super confident with the forehand and backhand down the line. He has no choice against Novak. You just have to play lower percentage tennis in general. Just move off, the default game plan. Something that Rafa Nadal didn't have to do at this point. But obviously, to get there, it took a while. 2011, what you'll notice as the year goes on, after those first two Sunshine double matches, Nadal looks more and more lost at sea for an answer. He's getting farther and farther away from being able to beat Novak. And all the way up until the third set of their last match of that season in the 2011 US Open final, there's really not many signs of encouragement. And at that, it took Nadal maybe winning the greatest set of all time, being down a break of serve 2 or 3 different times within the set, and visually just throwing the kitchen sink, everything he's got in the tank to get over the line and win this set in a tiebreaker. And I do mean that literally, because he has nothing left by the fourth set. But I think, it's that match where Nadal's like, okay, I get what I'm going to have to do. I'm going to have to push to the absolute limit of my abilities. It's going to take tennis that's going to be really, really hard to consistently replicate, but it is possible. And so commenced probably my favorite arc of his entire career. I think later on, and now because we're so far removed from it, media, even fans alike never did the greatest job of contextualizing Rafael Nadal's career, obviously because first and foremost, his clay accolades, his clay legacy is what you think about with him, and, the warrior, the never say die mentality, all that. But his early years, and particularly his prime, is pretty much split right down the middle. Middle being 2010, where, at different points in times, his two rivals were out of sorts. He kind of had that year to himself, but on one half of it, You're chasing a peak Roger Federer trying to get over that mountain. A guy who simultaneously is in the midst of probably the most dominant 3-4 year stretch in tennis history. Pretty much unbeatable to the rest of the field. And obviously, finally, after years of trying, getting closer and closer, is able to conquer that in the summer of 2008. And, obviously it's a A++ match on its own, but that sort of symbolism also does play into the whole narrative with Wimbledon 2008. Nadal finally toppling Federer and doing it, beating him on his own turf. But, after he is on top, back again, back healthy in 2010, is met with this unexpected challenge, and this time, unlike the Federer one, the matchup does not favor him. And I don't know, man, mentally, I think you saw, for the first time, Nadal getting rattled a little bit. I mean, I don't care who you are at any level. You start to lose a couple in a row, it mentally does start to snowball a little bit, and the scar tissue starts to build up. Much as a guy that, on the world stage had now lost 6 straight finals, all in big events, 2 major finals, basically punched in the mouth when, he was supposed to have the world at his mercy. And those guys are the athletes they are. They've had the careers they've had for a reason. I mean, even among the 1%ers, you saw in the 80s, Bjorn Borg walk away at 25, and obviously motivation was at play there, but he also started to lose more, particularly to Johnny Mack, a guy that was still, in the thick of his prime. That type of dynamic starts to wear on you, and it really did show for Rafa, particularly in the second half of 2011. You look through the results, US Open 2011 aside after Wimbledon, that confidence definitely took a hit. Not just against the guy that, had his number, but really everyone else. It wasn't until 2011 Davis Cup where the guy kind of rejuvenated himself, went back to work, even tinkered with, the setup of his racket, adding the lead tape, a couple pounds to give him more power on his groundies. And I'd imagine all of it was with the one guy that had been giving him fits for the last year in mind. And what do you know? We get him again at the Australian Open. It's Djokovic, Nadal, for a 3rd straight major final. At this point, everyone's rating Rafa's chances better. He's played an exemplary tournament, a couple of spectacular matches against Berdych and Federer in the quarters and semis. He has an extra day of rest, and Novak is coming off a near 5-hour marathon with Andy Murray. Surely that's going to have an impact going into a best-of-5 major final against Rafael Nadal. Early doors, it does. Djokovic comes out looking a little bit sluggish. Nadal hits first, but even in that first set, as we get to the middle of it and Djokovic is starting to warm up a little bit, it's starting to look a little bit like 2011 again. And Nadal's still able to bag that first set, on the back of starting better. But it's not convincing enough to, answer the questions of does he really have an answer to the Djokovic puzzle. And obviously, it looks a whole lot like 2011 through the next 2.5 sets. And in the 4th set, Djokovic leading 2-1 at 3-4, love 45 points from another title, and a seemingly routine walk down of Rafael Nadal in another major final. And it seems like Rafa's just going to have to keep searching. And then it happens. In isolation, I think the most impressive hold of Nadal's entire career. I mean, literally from love 40 down, balls to the wall, fearless, flawless tennis. All 5 straight points come with winners or service winners. It's kind of just like Nadal just threw caution to the wind right there, said, F it. If I'm going out, I'm going out swinging. And it really is one of those, one of the greats just refusing to lose moments. And between that and finding a way to will the tiebreaker home and see a 5th set, that right there is when Rafael Nadal finally broke the shackles. For the first time in over a year, finally feel like I can live with this guy, a well-playing version of this guy, on his favorite court and still give myself chances to win again. And, to the fans, to me, the way that match ended is still the most devastating loss I've ever experienced as a fan watching sports. I was just so crushed all day. 4-2, 30-15, that backhand miss is pretty much stamped into all of us Rafa fans' brains for those who saw it live. And, losing a match the way that he did, coming so close after being so close to losing in relatively routine fashion for 99.99999% of guys, even among the 1%ers, that is an impossible loss to shake for at least a little bit of time. I mean, just has to be a crushing blow to the psyche after, already losing 6 straight, coming so close to ending that streak, and still ending with the streak being pushed to 7 straight. It'd have to be a little bit discouraging, but it turns out, the competitive psychopath that he is, Nadal comes out of that match absolutely thrilled. I mean, you look at the end of that match, and, Djokovic is praying to get over the line in that last game, and Nadal still looks, he's looked the fresher player the entire 5th set, and he still looks like, he'd love to stay out there a bit longer. The guy's just entrenched in the battle until the very last ball. And turns out, 3 years later, in the build-up to the 2015 Australian Open, I think one of the promo or interviews he gave leading up to that event, he reveals his favorite Australian Open moment to that point is not his legendary 09 title run with the Epics back-to-back in the semis and finals. It's the loss. It's the 2012 Australian Open final. And moving forward, it definitely showed, again, a renewed sense of belief that, Nadal was not going to be being left behind in the shadow of this new unlocked Novak Djokovic that had his number. Through that match, through that final, he had somehow, some way clawed his way back to equal footing with this guy that, he said on Saturday had pushed him over his previous limits in a way that nobody did throughout his career. And, as a result, became very apparent very early on, the next time they met in clay season Monte Carlo, that Nadal was primed to break Djokovic's hold over him. Obviously won the next 3 matches on clay of 2012. Not that there wasn't any suspense. Obviously, Novak had Rafa in really one of his only ever spots of bother at Roland Garros during his prime. Even up 2 sets and, pretty much throughout the tournament and going into the final, it seemed a formality for Nadal's record-breaking 7th Roland Garros title. And still, from 2 sets down, only Novak Djokovic could make you believe, put that spot of doubt in fans and probably even Nadal's head, with a furious rally of 8 games in a row from 2 sets and a breakdown against an all-time great version of Nadal at Roland Garros. That's only Novak Djokovic. Of course, there was a fight, but at the end of the day, it just seemed written. Nadal was going to make his stand again in this rivalry and stand his ground at his beloved Roland Garros. A little bit of a bridge gap after that. Obviously, these two, particularly their last 3 or so Grand Slam finals, had pushed the boundaries of what is physically possible on a tennis court, and Nadal's body would be the first to break and keep him out of commission for a while. But we did pick up where we left off in 2013. One of Djokovic's 3 best clay court matches of all time. Their first meeting then at Monte Carlo, ending the 8 straight titles of Rafa Nadal at Monte Carlo. And then at Roland Garros, we kind of get a mirror match to the 2012 Australian Open. Not as physical a match, but it is similar in the sense that for nearly 4 sets, the favorite, the guy who's on his favorite court, it feels like smooth sailing, and that this one doesn't really have a prayer at seeing a 4th set. And this time, Nadal serving for the match at 6-5, 30-15. But backed into a corner this time, it's Djokovic who fires up and against all odds pushes us to a fifth set where the momentum's completely on his side. And just like that match, at 4-3 up a break in the fifth, finish line seemingly in sight, it is Djokovic at 4-3 deuce that touches the net on a point he's completely in control of. And just like the 2012 final, that one little flicker of hope is all that's needed. And now, from this point on, I think you have a little bit of role reversal where Djokovic is thrown into a little bit of a mental funk in the aftermath of this match. Being unable to secure, a signature win in his career there, it sort of feels like in the big ones moving forward, there's a bit of a cloud looming over him. And again, that's just so much of what I loved about this rivalry, particularly in this time frame, was what each Nadal and Djokovic took away from each other, the different passages in time where they're playing chess and forcing one another to react and forcing one another to get better in response. And Djokovic, is a little bit of a hangover effect. There's a mental funk that he doesn't completely shake until really the end of 2014. On the flip side, Rafael Nadal obviously goes on to win the French again, propels him into the best summer of his career, sweeping the North American hardcourt swing, where, of course, along the way, he beats Novak Djokovic in the semis, another epic in Canada, and then at the US Open in the final captures what will forever be a Mount Rushmore win in his career. Third set of that match, still the single greatest Houdini act, and my nominee for the most clutch moment of Nadal's career. Absolute thievery to get away with winning that set. The middle passage of that match, things seem to be snowballing. It looks a little bit like 2011 again, and Nadal absolutely just slams on the brakes, not only saving that set from nearly going down a double break at 1-3, but also once they were even again 4-all, love 40, another famous hold. And Novak Djokovic, dejected as anyone would be after losing a set like that. Rafa rides that momentum home to a signature win, and in doing so, completes his second scaling of the mountain, this time it being in the form of the Novak Djokovic challenge, and probably my favorite arc of Rafa Nadal's career, because something about that whole cliche of, what are you going to do when you're punched in the mouth? And I really do think this was the most revealing arc of Nadal's career, where you got a glimpse into the genius in pretty much all aspects. Obviously on court, the ability to execute, these just video game bonker shots that he was being forced to play, more audacious tennis, as I said. But also I think even more satisfying, just the character revelations, the resilience, staying positive and getting back up after being knocked down over and over again. And I know the critiques about this rivalry, that after that point in time, Nadal's not very competitive on hard courts, and that we went through long periods in time where one was just beating up on the other on their favorite surface. But boy, oh boy, when those matches hit, they hit like crazy. Nothing like it. Pretty much just guerrilla warfare on a tennis court. I think if you put Rafa and Novak on lie detectors, they probably would feel against all other opponents. I'm going to back myself mentally. If a match gets in the trenches, I feel pretty good about myself. But when it came to playing against one another, I would be inclined to say that they would each consider the other the only person that they would consider an equal in those departments. And I don't like throwing around these sports cliches, but in the confines of this rivalry, it is fitting because, the tenacity genuinely was off the charts in this particular rivalry. It always kept both guys on edge. Rafa, he's ever present, always dialed in to every single point. And that's not always the case with Novak. Novak can go through his peaks and valleys within matches himself. But against Rafa, it became very, very clear Unfortunately for us, with a rooting interest for the Nadal guy, Djokovic was always dialed in for Rafa, man. I mean, even all the way back to their final official match at the Olympics, a lot of us gave, Nadal a chance of making that match competitive with the year Djokovic had up till the Olympics. It wasn't because we thought Rafa was, in particularly good form, but that if he was going to challenge a top player, it might well be Djokovic, who is, not in the best form, not particularly healthy, and it was on Chatrier. And then all it took was about 5 minutes into that match to be like, he has no chance at all, because that was conditional with this Rafa of Novak being a good ways below his best. And for one last time, the antennas were up. All he needed to see was Nadal on the other side of the net, and it was as relentless as ever. And how many times did we see that over the years where Djokovic was just dialed in? He saw Rafa on the other side of the net, and it was just no nonsense. He knew the lapses that he could get away with against others and sort of manage the match on his terms, because he knew when the chips were down, it would be advantage Novak. Within the confines of this rivalry, he knew how costly a lapse against Nadal could be. And over the years, that resulted in some demolition jobs in his favor. No matter Nadal's form, there were just no let-ups. And on the flip side, it also gave us some of the most ferocious, thrilling contests of all time. And for what it's worth, late career, they did produce what I would consider to be their best match at Wimbledon in 2018. I do understand, greatest will always be Aussie 12. It has to be the 2012 Aussie final. It just has that type of bigger than tennis allure about it. And obviously, certain parts about it are about me just being chronically online, no doubt about it. But fan wars over the last 5-ish years have kind of ruined Rafole for me. And that's why this weekend was so sweet to see, off-court Nadal and Djokovic, now that the dust has settled, sort of grasp the significance of what they did and that they will always be tied at the hip. And now, no longer competitors, or only competitors for a little bit longer, be able to ease up with one another and sort of rekindle their relationship, all while, at the end of the match, being able to express to one another how much, this rivalry meant to them and what a remarkable journey it's been. And so, yeah, it's been a long, long ride, obviously, and I'm sure on both sides it's been a little bit of a love-hate, if not just diving in all the way into the hater pond. I know there's bad apples on both sides in every fan base, really. But one way or another, I will always have appreciation for Novak Djokovic for, what I consider to be one of the sweetest passages of time in my time as, self-proclaimed one of the biggest Rafa Nadal fans in this world. He unearthed a new dimension of Nadal's greatness for me. And now that, that chapter has closed with their rivalry, it really is surreal, but, I lived it, I loved it, and I couldn't have been more grateful to have been witness to, in my eyes, the greatest rivalry this sport has ever seen.
Ladies and gentlemen, if there were ever two athletes who deserved a standing ovation after that performance, it's these two great warriors.
Thank you, Novak. Thank you, Rafa. There really aren't any words.
No.
There really aren't. 5 hours, 53 minutes, the longest Grand Slam final, the longest Australian Open match.
Well, you think that you've seen almost everything, and then it boggles your mind what two men can do.